Hello everyone and welcome to the Total Gaming Podcast, a podcast where we bring you interesting talks and stories in and around the gaming world and a new topic discussed on every single episode. So if you haven't already, make sure you subscribe on YouTube, Spotify or iTunes so you don't miss an episode. In today's episode, we take a deep dive into something that's been discussed a million times before on TV, the news and media in general: violence in video games. Does it encourage people, including young kids, to act out or mimic violent acts in real life with what they see and play in video games? Why do the media point to video games as the cause of violence and their view from a societal perspective? When did games start becoming violent and why? We also look at the widespread media impact and coverage on the subject, the evidence that links or doesn't link games to violence, and what we can take from all our findings into the future. And of course, I'm trying to give my unbiased overall opinion on the subject at the end of this podcast too. Also, stay tuned to the end of this podcast for a special Fallout 76 giveaway that we are doing for the podcast listeners. Thank you for listening again, and I hope you find this episode insightful or at least thought-provoking, no matter what side you are on. This is Guns Don't Kill People, Video Games Do. When it came to doing this new podcast, I had a few goals in mind. One was to tell stories, to do something a bit different on a games podcast that I had no idea if people would enjoy it or like. Hopefully, if you're listening right now, you do. But another goal was to hopefully educate non-gamers or people just starting out in the hobby who may stumble upon the show and have heard about certain popular games or topics in the industry, such as the subject on today's episode that they may have seen in the news or elsewhere. I knew from the outset that this episode would be a challenge to make. Something as serious as real life killings and video games is an odd topic to mix, but it's something that if you've been playing games or own a television at the very least, you've seen your fair share of the two together, especially through the media. Much like most gamers, I've never really dived into the subject properly. Instead, I've mostly brushed it off and just seen it as a conjecture. It's true that the majority of people who have been playing games for a while, I would say 10 plus years, who say that the whole reporting of video games being used as precursors or training for violent acts in real life by that user is all just nonsense. Yet it keeps getting brought up time and time again. Why? So I set out making this episode well over a month ago, and one thing led to another, and I started to notice my inner pro gamer voice in me was coming out in my writing a little bit too much. Sort of mixing my opinion over facts, not giving one side a chance or a clear chance. So I rewrote a large section of this podcast and recorded it again to try give both sides of the argument a chance. It's a small note, but I want to make it perfectly clear from the very start. I'm not giving the answer to this topic as a whole. I really don't think I'm that qualified to really do that. This episode was an investigation to a topic I've seen pop up over the years time and time again. I've never really seen it discussed in a podcast form or investigated from both sides, even in a media form. There's also some important factors and topics I think need to be discussed, and they will, some of which I haven't seen or talked about when talking about violence in video games. With that out of the way, let's get on with the episode and talk about a topic that's been on my mind for the last 15 years.
We have to look at the internet because a lot of bad things are happening to young kids and young minds, and their minds are being formed. And we have to do something about maybe what they're seeing and how they're seeing it. And also video games. I'm hearing more and more people say the level of violence on video games is really shaping young people's thoughts. And then you go the further step.
Okay, so a lot of you heard about this incident recently, right? If not, this was Donald Trump's comments on video game violence in the wake of Florida's school shooting, in which Nicholas Cruz shot and killed 17 people at a high school. Comments on video game violence in school shootings is not a new thing. In fact, as far as I can remember as a young child, video games had this great taboo subject about them when it came to violence. I never knew what to make of them. At first I thought that video games were not that bad for me, that I was turning out okay. I didn't have any anger issues, but then I see another news story about a killer and how much he wanted to play Grand Theft Auto just like me. And I start to wonder. And yes, I played Grand Theft Auto age 15, and I think a lot of us did at that age. The aim of this episode is a focus on that point. Are games to blame for people who commit these crimes? Are games too violent and realistic that it's become too real and warping people's minds into real life violent acts if they want to commit them? Or does something need to be discussed that hasn't been discussed yet in the mainstream media? We'll get to the current day situation with video game violence with politicians and media later, but for now, we need to go back in time to see just when did video game violence started to be shown to the public.
To sweep the country and most of the world too, millions of people are addicted to hours of gazing at electronic images on game screens in arcades and in their own homes. What makes video games so popular? Well, we search for an answer as we begin a special series on Video Fever, games people play.
The late 70s and early 80s time was the boom of the arcade games. Games like Pong, Space Invaders and Breakout were all games released around this time. Games were a very new thing at this time, and they were a new exciting way of having fun, challenging your friends and slowly creating the first generation of hardcore and casual video game players. Now, I'm not going to say that something like Space Invaders was extremely violent, but you can't deny that it had its elements of violence in it. I mean, you are shooting and killing aliens with your ship, but by today's standards that's like comparing Barney the dinosaur to the Saw movies. Space Invaders was never looked as controversial. However, in 1976, with what's now known as the first banned video game, was created. It was called Death Race, and it was created by a developer called XC. Death Race was a fairly simple game. You drove a car and you had a time limit to run over pixelated moving figures on the screen. Whenever you ran over the pixelated figure, you would hear this noise, and a gravestone would pop up. Now, the figures moving on the screen were supposed to represent gremlins, as the developer would say, but they're not supposed to represent actual people getting hit and killed by a car. But many still branded the game concerning, especially for children. Because the majority of video games were only played in arcades where anyone could just jump in on any game they see, this was seen as very worrying. But games like this were very rare, and the majority of games released over the 70s and 80s were just plain old simple games that we all know and love. Getting a game banned for being rude or too violent was a very unusual thing. It only started to get notorious in the 1990s. Infamously, the game Night Trapped, a full motion video or FMV style game where you play as a special agent tasked with keeping watch over teenage girls in a house that's full of traps and enemies. If you failed, you would get a very particular game over screen in this game. The women would be killed but not on screen. It was sort of left to your own imagination. The game was branded as sick and ultra violent and was taken off many stores' shelves around the USA. The game's objective, though, was not to kill anyone. It was to try save the girls, and showing you the consequence of your failures was meant to shock you, especially as this was using real life footage in a game. As much as unsettling as Night Trap was, it's also worth knowing that this game was released in the same year as movies such as Jason Goes to Hell and the Freddy Krueger movies, and they could be argued that they were more violent than Night Trap. So why was a video game targeted to be banned? Well, the obvious suggestion is that video games, unlike movies, have a major interaction element to them. You control the outcomes, whether to fail or succeed. When video game violence is mixed into this, to some people, it makes it look like the player either enjoys this type of content or is sometimes encouraged to do violent acts in a video game. It depends on the game though. In a game like Night Trap, your goal is to avoid the disturbing imagery at the time the game over screens. But if we were to take a game like Grand Theft Auto, where you are actively killing people in the game, either by your own free will or as an objective for a mission. Yet Night Trap wasn't the only game to make the headlines for its controversial content, and this game would start the evolution of video game violence as well as the video game's rating system.
Test your might. Test your might. Test your might. Test your might.
In 1992, Mortal Kombat was released to critical praise by the gaming press, many hailing it as the new adult version of Street Fighter. But unlike Street Fighter, Mortal Kombat was surrounded in controversy upon release. Mortal Kombat was a fighting game, yes, but the reason for the controversy was its extreme, lifelike at the time, violence. Players could do final devastation killing blows known as fatalities, which were, while they were creative, were more violent killing moves. Mortal Kombat stayed in stores, however, after the evolution of video games, seeing them turn from a simple Pong game into a game where you could kick someone's head off. And in order for parents to be aware of what kind of game they were buying for their children, the ESRB, or Entertainment Software Ratings Board, was created in 1994.
How about this one?
What's it rated?
D.
Nice try. Hey, try this one, and I think your dad will go for it. For more info, there's a rating search app, and you can set parental controls at home. Alright, thanks. I'll check that
So
out.
let's ask a question that may be obvious to some of you, but I think it's worth bringing up. Why is it that some games started to introduce violent themes at this time? Before the introduction of violent games, games were selling pretty well, so why was it needed to create violent video games? Personally, it's a case of inevitability. It was always going to happen. We already had violent movies at this time, and as another form of visual entertainment, it was bound to happen. If we remove movies from the equation, we also need to think about ideas or target audiences. Games are now tailor-made to specific people. If we just got the same old rating for every game for years and years, well, video games would just get boring very, very quickly. And video games would most likely only be popular past a certain age. But maybe that type of question is seen in a different way. Maybe it's more of a deeper question, like, why is it that we have the need to have violence in a game, and why do people like it? I don't think it's a case of we need to have violence in games. In fact, some of the best games from the indie scene are not known for their violent acts in games. Violence and more realistic violence seems to pop up more and more in our AAA titles nowadays. So why is that? Well, it could be down to two reasons. The first is violence sells. As bad as that may sound, the shock of gore plays a big part in certain game titles. For instance, take a game like The Condemned 2, a first-person horror adventure game that has you beating the living shit out of some people with pipes, crowbars, or even your bare fists. The goriness in the dark, unsettling tone is almost there to relieve the player of the suspense of playing the game, almost like a rush of endorphins after you get from a jump scare. You've just beat up this big scary dude to death. Now relax, sort of thing. I'm not saying that all horror genres, especially violent horror genres, follow this trend. Take Alien Isolation, for example. You spend the majority of that game just trying to hide and not receive, in fact, a violent death to the character you are playing. And like I said before, there are audience out there just looking for something that is more mature, more to their liking. Not everyone who plays a game will like the same thing, and when it comes to violence, something that can top the last AAA ultra-violent game may just get enough interest by doing just that. The second reason, and the one I think is more reasonable, is that it's all to do with advancements in graphics and technology. AAA games are looking at more and more ways to achieve ultra-realistic graphics, even to the point where you feel like you're actually in the game, particularly with the advancements with VR. But the thing to remember is that because the progression in tech and graphics, things that were considered brutal in terms of its violence 10 or 15 years ago are now not seen as that bad. While the intended content might have been the same, it's much more difficult to see someone's spine breaking in 8-bit video games compared to the photorealistic games of today. This is true with movies too, as a human race we're constantly trying to make bigger and better things. Imagery seen as ban-worthy a long time ago are nothing in comparison to the imagery that can get in trouble with the media today. Indie games I feel fall under this too, as they are mostly created by small teams and running on much more basic game engines. Even today they still run on 16-bit or 30-bit engines or even a basic 3D engine. While AAA games are there to make new grounds in realism and see how far they can push tech and perhaps shock and violence in games, indie titles mostly stay on the side of the lower levels of extreme imagery due to the less lifelike graphics it can show. If this is arguably the case, and AAA games are pushing the boundaries of what we can do in games, what is the key ingredient that sells games? Is a game trying to be as controversial as possible without trying to go too overboard? Maybe it's a big factor in marketing when it comes to generating hype and sales for a game. If it's not intentional, then is even your standard modern game with some violence a ban-worthy game if it's not a popular game? Take your recent calls of Fortnite trying to be banned as kids were reportedly getting addicted to the game. No matter what it may be, how many factors it could be down to, there is one thing for sure. The impact and relationship between the national media and video games hasn't been a particularly friendly one, to say the very least.
Pretty graphic, pretty gory. You know them, Call of Duty. I don't do any of these, but
what Grand Theft Auto?
Yeah, they're simulated violence.
It's a criminal simulator, a murder simulator.
Yeah, Evan Ramsey, others like some of these other killers, Dylan Klebold, Eric Harris of Columbine, were steeped in these games. Adam Lanza.
The Norway killer trained on those. He said he trained on them. 69 dead on an island in Norway, and he spent a year training on video games to prepare himself for this crime. The killer in Florida, he spent 15 hours a day on violent video games.
Normally today, when we first hear of a brutal game that is shocking people and parents, most of the time, it's through the news. Infamously, Rockstar, the developers of the Grand Theft Auto series, have seen their fair share of news coverage throughout the years. Nearly every game under the Grand Theft Auto series banner has come under attack via media coverage. In Grand Theft Auto or GTA, you live a life in the criminal underworld, with each game trying to create a realistic, living, breathing city. With the improvement in graphical and engine specs, the possibilities are almost endless. The game offers almost total free will, allowing you to shoot, kill, drive over someone, drown someone, stab someone, etc, etc. Let's face it, the Grand Theft Auto series is a video game playground for violence and freedom that has arguably made it one of the greatest video game franchises of all time, from both a commercial and critical acclaim perspective. However, no matter how successful the series has been, it's also seen as one of the most controversial series of all time. And it seems like time and time again the subject gets brought up with every new popular violent release. As I said at the start of this podcast, I wanted to talk about a subject that's been on my mind for the last 15 years, and how I noticed news bulletins even as a young kid that would tell me that video games were bad for me. So let's look at this mainstream media coverage, because to me, once the news gets involved, it turns a conversation to a damn right, ill-informed, twisting, and sometimes ridiculous argument. Let's start off with the idea of why games are bad for you from popular mainstream media on TV.
Linked to the violent character. If it's a first-person shooter game, you have the same visual perspective as the killer. You get points when you kill people. If you kill enough people, you get to advance to the next level of the game. You're also rewarded through things that you might hear. If you kill somebody, maybe you hear impressive, nice shot.
Under all of this, all of these reports of video gaming that get brought up, one stood out so much in my research that I found it the most ridiculous part that I mentioned before. Why is the blame not being aimed at bad parenting rather than video games are bad for you and your kids? The impact of parents being uneducated in video games is that they would look at these news channels and their endless supply of video games are bad for you opinion pieces and believe the news channels must be right, or at the very least must know what they're talking about. The harsh reality of the situation is that no matter how many actual qualified professionals the news media have on their show to talk about the subject, no matter how many times they say video games do not cause violence, it seems to either be downplayed or completely ignored in some cases. Parents could say that it is video games that cause kids to be violent and they shouldn't be sold in the first place. But if parents regulated the time and rating of each game that's clearly displayed on the front of each video game box, surely they would know what is age safe for their children to play. One thing that's very clear from these clips that you've probably already noticed is most of these are from news stations from America, a place where being able to carry a gun is a lot more common than most countries. So video games are the problem because they teach people how to kill? You could look at it that way, and what I've watched over the past years, this seems to be the argument time and time again. But when you get to the core of the situation, you also have to include the fact that maybe gun law in America is the issue. The problem is the media. That's not included in most cases. Sure, you'll get news bulletins about gun crime and itself being a horrible thing, but as soon as the media learn that the killer liked to play a bit of Call of Duty now and again, the story almost 90% of the time gets flipped and changed and never lets go. So instead of blaming violence on the gun and gun laws itself in America, which we all know has been a subject discussed for many years, the media will actively try to push to the viewer that video games caused, or at least trained, the killer to do this rather than the gun laws being the focus. So why is this, you ask? Well, there are many theories on the issue. Overall, when we look at the media when it's covered violence in video games, 90% of the time it does come across as either attacking the games industry for having the sake of putting official blame on the situation, or it's ill-informed reporting by the people whose last video game they played was Mario in the 1980s. I do believe that video game violence is not a good thing. It's not something we should be proud of, nor do I think it's something that kids should be playing. But that's up to proper regulation by the parents and the media having the understanding that games clearly do not train kids to become killers, or putting blame shouldn't be put on the game developers on an 18 rated game when a kid buys it. The trouble is though, when something as serious as murder does happen and the media grabs hold of the murderer's history and find out they've played video games quite a lot, that thought tends to go out the window. One of the most shocking incidents that showcased this was the murderer Warren Leblanc. In February of 2004 in Leicester, England, 17-year-old Warren Leblanc was arrested after he lured his 14-year-old friend Stefan Pakura into a park, stunning him with a hammer and stabbing him. It was described as a brutal crime, with Stefan sustaining over 50 injuries to his body. I spoke earlier on how as a young boy I saw the media saying that violent video games were bad for you. Well, this is a story that I remember very fondly at the time because I started to notice the widespread coverage it got. A few days after the murder, it was reported that Warren used to play the game Manhunt, another game by Grand Theft Auto developers Rockstar, and he reportedly used to obsess over the game. So much in fact that the way he killed Stefan was eerily similar to an execution move that the player can do in Manhunt. The mother of Stefan called for and believed that violent video games were the cause of her son's death, and pleaded that violent video games should be banned so that a similar incident wouldn't happen again. The UK media went into full-blown coverage on the story, with the Daily Mail making its front page story with "Ban These Evil Games" headline, reporting on titles such as Grand Theft Auto, Manhunt, The Suffering and more. Other headlines included by other papers included "In Your High Streets, A World of Horror" and "Don't Let Your Children Simulate Murder." Warren was given life in prison with a minimum sentence of 13 years. The judge told Warren that he didn't believe that video games had any effect on what he did, and that what he did was a savage human act at his own accord. What is mind-boggling is that nearly every case that has been some connection to video games did not state that video games were the cause. Just a brutal human act. As bad as that may sound, I think it's important to remember. Well, there are two things to remember here, I feel. Number one, most of the time the media brings up the fact that violent video games may have an effect on people. And number two, and what is more important I feel, potential killers may play video games. Yep, you've heard that right, I'm going in the opposite direction now. Killers and violent people most likely play games, and it's pretty simple. Gaming is a hugely popular form of entertainment, one if not the biggest in the world. So what are the chances that one of these players turns out to have killer instincts one day? It's pretty likely, right? However, I'm looking at it in the concept of probability, while the media look at it as an influence. more or less like games can make a person more violent because they simulate violent acts or they are used as training to train a killer. But that's the media, and whether you believe them or not, what do the actual experts say? It seems like an obvious question when talking about human behavior, but surely some tests have been done, studies even monitoring the human body before and after playing a video game? Well, there are plenty.
One of the problems in this field is that people confuse aggression and violence. Some research will call sort of a competitiveness type aggression as equivalent to violence in the real world. There's absolutely no evidence that any video game or violent movie for that matter has ever caused a real world violent act.
Now a consultant, she recently met with Vice President Biden and his task force.
Playing violent video games is a normative behavior for teenagers today, especially boys, but for a lot of girls. It's true.
Just part of their life.
It's true that the Newtown, Connecticut shooter apparently played violent video games. But the local kids on your soccer team, your 13-year-old boys who live down the street from you, they're all playing these violent games too. And they are probably okay.
If you want to know the frustrating and downright confusing part of this, it seems like all of this gets ignored, despite having professionals, sometimes even on the mainstream media TV shows, explain that there was no evidence or link between video game violence and real-world violence. Time and time again, the link between murder and video game violence gets brought up on TV shows, news channels, even our own politicians get involved. Round and around all the time for the last 20 years, time and again.
And suddenly, they're seeing and how they're seeing
it all stops. It all goes quiet. The media focuses on a different topic. The way we play or buy games doesn't change. Everything just goes quiet again. Now you may say, if you don't believe there's a link between violence and video games, that's good. Everyone finally stops talking about it eventually. And while I agree, it's also what made me incredibly frustrated with the way things are. You see, while I don't believe that there's a link, there's part of me that is frustrated at the fact that this topic is clearly exploited in the media too much, and then it all goes quiet, waiting to bring it up again after the next video game related murder to flash up on your TV screens. It almost sounds like this is a temporary distraction from the real world issue. A few months ago, while writing this episode, this story broke out.
Saw somebody just like standing there with two hands on a gun and just walking back. The first gunshot sounded like a balloon pop.
2 victims shot to death, 10 others shot and wounded by this gunman who opened fire at a video game tournament before taking his own life.
I was right there. I was right in front of me. I actually saw the 2 people that were killed.
Now, as tributes pour in for the 2 victims who were killed, questions remain unanswered about the motive behind the shooting spree.
On August 26, 2018, 24-year-old David Katz opened fire in a building of 150 people, killing 2 people and wounding 10 people before turning the gun on himself. David Katz was known as a strange, quiet, but serious gamer. He had entered the Madden tournament on the weekend only to lose halfway into the tournament. Angered by losing, he walked into the building after grabbing his handgun from his hotel room and decided to kill innocent people. David had a series of mental illness issues in the past. It was reported that he had to take medicine to treat his schizophrenia and that he was also placed on 2 antidepressants. While this story seems like just another video game related shooting, I think it's quite an important one to look at. In fact, I think it's the most important one when talking about this subject. In the cases we have looked at in this podcast, I related to video game violence and how violence in video games seems to be covered as a tool or a program to make people violent. And even if you agree that to be true or not, you have to look at this case to understand there's more to it than that. This was a Madden game, this was an American football game. Rated safe for everyone to play. It shows hard tackles, yes, but so do most sports. But nothing violent, nothing ultra violent at all. The game's violence is out of the question here of why David did what he did. What's more troubling is 2 things: a man's anger at losing at a competitive tournament and why he had a gun with him in his hotel room. Let's briefly talk about video games and do they make you more aggressive even if the game is violent or not. For the majority of people, and after looking at a couple of studies on this subject, It does not lead people to violent acts similar to David's, however, the obvious signs are there. Video games do increase your heart rate. If playing competitively, of course, they would make you frustrated if you lost. I think everyone has experienced that. But video games are not the only reason for competitiveness. You could almost point out any sports or even a school talent show, for crying out loud, and have some, if not a lot of people, angry when they didn't win a tryout, pass an exam, or win a competition. Either angry at themselves or angry at others for their success. It's human nature. They feel defeated. This is normal. The main point of this is to highlight what was the standout and the sole reason for bringing this story up, and it's an obvious one. Gun control, especially in the USA, not to mention David had a gun with a mental illness. In fact, nearly all the stories I've looked up when it comes to gun crime and video games have been in the US. I know a lot of you know that gun crime in the US is on the levels of ridiculous when it comes to killings, so I won't go on about it. But here lies the overall and huge problem with the link of video games and violence. The stories I've talked about, the media coverage. Have they been talking about gun crime and control? It's almost like blaming video games is like a distraction from the real issue here. To close off this podcast, I wanted to give my honest thoughts on what I've learned and seen from playing video games and seeing these stories pop up for what seems like once every year. I love video games. I think that video games are the most exciting, if not the most exciting use of entertainment that we have today. I love how they can bring people together. I love how people who find it hard to make friends in real life and struggle making friends in real life can find people just like themselves online. And if you're young and you're listening to this podcast, and no matter what your parents tell you, I'm okay in telling you as a 27-year-old man that video games are not bad for you. However, I do feel like they need to be regulated by parents at an early age. Spending hours and days every week playing them as a kid is not good for your future self. And while I don't believe they cause violence or anything like that, they will make you lazy and antisocial. Parents, please understand that video games are only violent because your child has somehow got a copy of a video game that is rated for adults only. Video games, just like movies, have a rating system on the front of the box that tells you what age it's suitable to play this game. Blaming the games industry for a responsibility that the parents should be doing is not the game's developers' fault, no matter what the news media may tell you, because they are not going to blame the parents since they are the kind of target audience for those people who are watching the news. Educate yourselves with video games. You don't necessarily have to play them, just educate yourself to find out what they're about, and you'll have a better understanding on what types of games are suitable for children. Trying to convince the mainstream media to change is not going to happen anytime soon, but I do hope in the future, as this generation of gamers become older, that things will change. The problem with the early 90s and 80s way of looking at games is that they were not around as much or as popular when the mums and dads of the 90s and 80s were kids. Therefore, it's mostly seen as a bigger, more popular hobby today. My hope is that the general understanding of what is good and what is bad in video games becomes mainstream and clear, and we eventually stop looking to put blame on others and look at the core problem of the situation. Yes, I know it's very, very easy for me to say all these things because I've played video games all my life and I'm a fan. But if any bit of this podcast has made you think about something in a new way or learn something new, then I know I've done my job right with this episode. And hey, if you thought the whole link between video games was nonsense anyway, I hope you were able to see some of the reasons of why video games get labelled the way they do. As I said from the start, I'm not a professional when it comes to human behaviour. All I wanted was to create an episode that focused on the topic and try to see both sides of each argument and try to answer as many questions as possible. And I hope that was achieved with this episode. Guys, thank you so much for listening to this episode of the Total Gaming Podcast. We got really, really great feedback on the first episode, and I know most of you seem to dig this new type of format. I decided to do the Total Gaming Podcast in this kind of format because I felt like there were too many games podcasts that just talked about the same things every week, usually what's trending that week, but hopefully this is something new and something fresh for you to listen to every month. Speaking of, if you are new here, we try and aim to release a podcast every month or so. Due to the amount of time it takes to create one of these, we have to stick to one a month, but you never know what the future might bring. To summarize, the Total Gaming Podcast aims to cover interesting stories, subjects, and interesting people in and around the gaming world. If you're a Fallout fan, we got two things to let you know about. We're currently doing a Fallout 76 beta code giveaway. We have 6 codes to give away. We've got 2 for Xbox, 2 for PlayStation, and 2 for PC. All you have to do to enter is to leave us a review on the Apple Podcast page, or you can leave us a comment on the YouTube comment section of this podcast. Just make sure you leave us your email and your platform of choice at the end of your review or comment, and you'll be entered into the draw. So good luck and get entering today. The codes and winners will be contacted a week before each of the betas starts. Also, please make sure you check out our previous episode, Fallout 76 Before the Great War. It might be something you've missed out on, and it might be something just up your street if you're into the stories and lore of the Fallout universe. And if you haven't already, please subscribe so you don't miss a future episode. As I said before, if you're listening on Apple Podcasts, please leave us a review and rating, as it really does help the podcast out. The podcast is also available on Spotify. Just search Total Gaming Podcast and hit the follow button to stay up to date. You can find Total Gaming on YouTube at youtube.com/Total Gaming Official. Make sure you subscribe and check out our videos too. We got a couple of exciting projects coming up in the pipeline. And our social medias, our Twitter is @tweetsfromTG. Our Facebook is facebook.com/Total Gaming Official. You can find us on Instagram if you just search for Total Gaming Official, all one word. And you can follow me on my personal Twitter account, that's @DanTalksALot. We have a brand new exciting episode out in about a month's time, but for now, thank you so much for listening, and I'll see you next time.